He was only 8 years old when he died the first time, not in a hospital bed, not in the arms of his mother. He died crushed inside a mangled car, buried under shattered glass and twisted metal. And when they pulled his lifeless body from the wreckage, they had no idea what was waiting on the other side. This isn't a story about survival. It's a story about what comes after life ends, and why an ordinary boy named Landon Whitley came back with a terrifying message that no one could ignore. If you think you know what happens after death, you haven't heard what Landon saw when his heart stopped beating. Twice. It was a typical Sunday for the Whitley family. Church service in the morning, like always. Smiles, laughter, the sound of gospel music still ringing in their ears as they climbed into their red Pontiac Sunfire. Julie Whitley sat in the passenger seat beside her husband Andy, who was driving. Landon sat in the back, probably daydreaming like any kid his age, not a care in the world. The skies were clear, the roads weren't busy, and the world seemed calm. They were just a few minutes from home when they came to an intersection that, to this day, Julie wishes they'd never entered. Andy glanced left and right. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but just as they rolled forward, Andy suddenly shouted. Julie turned her head, trying to understand what he was yelling about, but it was too late. The next second was pure chaos. An ambulance, traveling at full speed but without its siren on, tore through the intersection and slammed directly into their car. The sound was deafening, the impact so violent it launched their small vehicle across the pavement like a toy. Glass shattered, metal bent like paper, and in an instant everything went black. Julie came to, dazed and bleeding, her ears ringing, unsure of where she was or what had just happened. Andy wasn't moving, and Landon was nowhere to be seen. Rescue teams arrived quickly, but what they found was horrifying. The car was crushed so completely they couldn't even see Landon at first. It took them precious minutes to locate him in the wreckage. When they finally did, his body wasn't moving, he wasn't breathing, his heart wasn't beating. Julie, still trapped in the twisted frame of the front seat, had no idea that her son had already died once. The EMTs worked on Landon right there on the pavement, desperately trying to bring him back. After several tense moments, a faint pulse returned, but no one knew if it would last. A helicopter was called in immediately to airlift him to a trauma center, but before they could even reach the hospital, Landon flatlined again, dead for the second time. Doctors would later say that most people don't come back from something like that, not once, let alone twice. The trauma to his body was immense. The force of the crash alone should have snapped his spine. But somehow, as the medical team fought to restart his heart again during the flight, Landon's soul had already left his body. He wasn't in the air, he wasn't in the ambulance, he was somewhere else, somewhere completely different from anything we can imagine. And that's where the story really begins. Landon would later describe what happened in those moments. Not as a dream, not as a hallucination, but as something more real than anything he had ever felt on Earth. The second his heart stopped, he felt himself drifting upward, away from the broken body he no longer needed. The pain was gone. The noise of sirens, shouting, and chaos faded into silence. And then, suddenly, he was surrounded by light. Not just any light. This was different. It was alive, warm, brighter than the sun, but it didn't hurt to look at. In fact, it drew him in. He wasn't scared. He wasn't confused. He said it felt like coming home. Everything was familiar, though he couldn't explain why. Streets that shimmered with gold stretched out beneath his feet, and colors he had never seen before filled the air like music made visible. There were no shadows, no fear, only peace. And then he saw them. Figures, glowing, moving toward him, smiling, not strangers, but people he somehow recognized. His father was there. Andy Whitley, who had died instantly in the crash, stood before Landon, not broken or bruised, but whole, filled with light, his eyes calm and kind. Landon ran to him, but instead of speaking in words, they communicated through something deeper, like understanding each other's thoughts instantly. Then more people began to appear, a man and a woman he didn't know, but somehow he did. He knew they were family, even though he had never seen their faces before. There were no introductions, no explanations needed. In heaven, he said, you just know. Later, after he woke up, Landon told his mother something that made her knees buckle. He said, "Mum, I saw your other two kids." Julie froze. She hadn't told anyone, not even Landon, that before he was born, she had suffered 2 miscarriages, tiny lives lost too soon, babies she had never named. But somehow, Landon had met them. He described them as young, full of joy, and radiating the same golden light as everyone else there. He didn't ask who they were, he just knew. "They told me they were my brother and sister," he said, "and they were happy." Julie couldn't believe it. She had never breathed a word about her miscarriages. No one had. Yet Landon had returned with knowledge that only a mother would understand. It was more than comfort. It was confirmation that those souls, those children she mourned in silence, were real. They existed. They were waiting. He described heaven as a place without pain or fear, where love wasn't just felt. It was the very air you breathed. Time didn't seem to exist. Everything was alive in a way that earth could never match. Flowers sang. Light moved like waves. And then Jesus came. Not as a shadowy figure or glowing silhouette, but as a person Landon recognized instantly, even though he had never seen a picture that truly captured him. Jesus walked toward him and radiated something far beyond love. It was a power so strong, Landon said he couldn't stand up. He dropped to his knees without being told to. It wasn't out of fear, it was out of awe. Jesus looked him in the eyes, and Landon felt everything, his entire life, every thought, every feeling, laid bare. And still, there was no judgment, only purpose. Jesus told him something that would change everything. "You must go back," he said. "You're not finished. You have work to do. You must tell others about me." It wasn't optional. Landon didn't want to leave. He was safe. He was whole. He was surrounded by people he loved. But Jesus said the world needed to hear the truth, and Landon was chosen to be one of the messengers. Before he could argue, he felt himself falling, faster and faster, back into his body, back into pain, back into the hospital where machines were beeping and voices were shouting. He was back, but he was not the same. What he saw wasn't just some emotional comfort to help him through trauma. He came back with information no child should have. Names, faces, events he could not have known. And from that moment on, Landon Whitley was no longer just an accident victim. He was a boy sent back with a mission, charged with a message from Jesus himself. Tell them I am real. Tell them there is more, and tell them time is running out. When Landon opened his eyes again, it wasn't to golden light or heavenly music. It was to fluorescent hospital bulbs and the sterile cold of a trauma room. His body felt like it had been through a war. Tubes ran in and out of his skin, machines surrounded him, and his head was wrapped tightly in bandages. But something was different. He didn't panic. He didn't cry. The first words he spoke weren't about pain or confusion. They were about Jesus, about heaven, about the message. The doctors, who had already warned his mother that he would likely never wake up, were stunned. Not only had Landon regained consciousness after being clinically dead twice, but there were no signs of brain damage. None. And yet his skull had been shattered. His body had suffered injuries so devastating that some had quietly assumed it would be more humane if he simply didn't survive. But he did. And when he did, he came back with clarity in his eyes and a mission in his heart. Julie could hardly believe what she was seeing. Just days earlier, she had been preparing herself to say goodbye. Doctors had told her to expect a shell of the child she once knew. They warned her he might never walk again, that he would likely never speak clearly or understand who she was. They said, "If he survives, you'll be caring for a permanently disabled child. You need to prepare for that." Julie nodded, smiled weakly, and walked away. But in her heart, she refused to accept that. She prayed. She begged God for a miracle. And when Landon spoke, clearly and purposefully, describing things he couldn't possibly know, she knew that miracle had come. It wasn't just a recovery, it was a resurrection. But the miracle didn't end with a beating heart or coherent speech. Landon's body had been through hell. He had sustained massive head trauma. Doctors had to reconstruct parts of his skull using metal plates, 23 of them in total. Part of his skull was used to rebuild his nose. He had lost vision in one eye. His face bore deep scars, and his body would never look the same. But none of that seemed to matter to Landon. He didn't focus on what he had lost. He only cared about what he had gained and what he had been sent back to do. Once the shock of his physical survival began to settle, Julie faced an even harder moment, telling Landon that his father didn't survive. She waited, holding back tears, trying to find the right time, the right words, the right moment to break her son's heart. But before she could say anything, Landon looked at her and said, "I know." Julie froze. "I saw him in heaven," he said calmly. "He's okay." And just like that, the pain she feared would crush him was already healed. Then came the moment that would change Julie forever. "Mom," Landon said, "I forgot to tell you, I saw your other 2 kids." Confused, she asked what he meant. "They were there," he said. "They were happy. I knew they were mine." Julie had to sit down. She had never told Landon about her 2 miscarriages. They were the kind of quiet tragedies mothers carry in their hearts but rarely speak aloud. And yet her son had just described them with detail and confidence, as if he'd known them all his life. "In heaven," he explained, "you just know who everyone is. You don't have to ask, you just know." That moment shattered any remaining doubt. Julie wasn't talking to a boy who had barely survived. She was talking to someone who had seen beyond. Someone who had stood in the presence of Jesus Christ and come back. Someone who had seen her unborn children, her husband, and a realm more real than Earth itself. She believed every word. And Landon wasn't done. He began to describe more. Not just what he saw, but what he was told. He said Jesus gave him a command. It wasn't flowery, it wasn't symbolic, it was specific. "You have to go back. Be a good Christian. Tell others about me." He said Jesus looked him in the eyes and spoke with a voice that carried more weight than thunder and more love than 1,000 lifetimes. It wasn't a request, it was a commission. "Tell them I am real," he said. "Tell them heaven is real. Tell them not to be afraid, but to be ready." From that moment on, Landon knew his life was not his own. He had been sent back for a reason, and the pain he endured, the surgeries, the long recovery, it was all worth it to carry that message. He didn't ask why he had to suffer, or why his dad didn't come back too. He didn't dwell on the unfairness of it all. He had seen the bigger picture, and that picture was beautiful. He wasn't afraid anymore. Not of death, not of pain, not of anything. He had seen the face of Jesus, and that changed everything. Landon's return to life wasn't the end of the story. In many ways, it was only the beginning. Because even though he was alive, breathing, and aware, his journey was far from over. The physical scars on his body would take years to heal. Multiple surgeries followed, countless days spent in recovery. He had to relearn how to walk, how to balance, how to cope with the loss of sight in one eye. But none of that broke him. Instead, Landon seemed more determined with each passing day. There was something in him now that hadn't been there before. An unshakable resolve, like he was carrying something larger than himself. A fire had been lit, and no pain could put it out. While most kids his age were worried about school or friends or video games, Landon was focused on something eternal. He had a mission stamped into his soul, and he was ready to follow it, no matter how hard it would be. As the months passed, Landon didn't just recover, he transformed. The boy who had once died twice now stood as living proof that something exists beyond this life, and he couldn't stay silent about it. He began sharing his story, not because he wanted attention, not because someone told him to, but because he felt he had to. It was obedience, a promise he made to Jesus face to face. Landon spoke at churches, youth groups, and wherever people would listen. And when he spoke, people listened differently. It wasn't just the content of his words, it was the weight behind them. He wasn't quoting scripture from memory. He wasn't preaching out of habit. He was telling what he had seen, the way his eyes lit up when he talked about heaven, the way his voice softened when he mentioned meeting Jesus. Those weren't the traits of someone repeating a rehearsed story. Those were the signs of someone who had been there. And then there was the urgency. Landon would talk to strangers and friends alike with the same serious tone, saying things like, "You need to be ready. You need to know him." And when people asked why, his answer was always the same. Because he's coming back. There was no hesitation in his voice when he said it. No doubt. Just calm certainty, the kind of certainty that shakes people. Some didn't believe him. Some thought he was just a traumatized child who had dreamed it all up. But others could feel it. That strange conviction that what he was saying was true, even if they couldn't explain how they knew. Julie watched all of this unfold with a mix of awe and reverence. She had seen her child broken, dying twice, and brought back. She had seen him speak truths that no child should know. And now she was seeing her son take up a calling that would stretch far beyond anything she had ever imagined. She saw how people responded to him, how hearts softened, how strangers wept, how skeptics listened quietly, unsure of how to argue with a child who had touched the other side. Landon didn't just tell people heaven was real, he reminded them what it felt like to believe. He brought that reality down to earth with every word he spoke. But it wasn't always easy. There were nights Landon would wake up crying from pain, struggling to breathe, aching in his bones. He still carried the weight of a broken body. The surgeries left him exhausted. The physical scars, though healing, were constant reminders of the price he had paid. And yet, he never complained, not once, because he believed that every ounce of suffering was worth it if it meant even one person would believe in Jesus through his story. That was the deal. That was the calling, and he had no intention of letting it go to waste. He didn't care about being famous. He didn't chase interviews or headlines. What he cared about was obedience. He remembered what Jesus had said, "Tell them about me." And so he did. In schools, on stages, in hospitals, wherever he was asked, he spoke. Not like a preacher, not like a celebrity, but like a messenger. Like someone who had seen what was coming and returned to warn the world. And the world listened. Because they could tell, this wasn't a story crafted to inspire or sell books. This was a story that carried eternity behind it. A story with weight. And in that weight, people found something they had lost. Hope. A reason to believe. A reason to come back to faith. Landon didn't ask for this mission. He didn't choose it, but once he had it, he carried it with everything he had. And with every step he took, scarred, limping, partially blind, he moved closer to the reason he was sent back in the first place. To be a voice, to be a sign, to be a living reminder that death is not the end, that Jesus is real, and that time is shorter than we think. Landon's story didn't stay small. As the years passed, more people heard what had happened to him. Not just from his family or local church, but across the country. Word spread. Articles were written. His testimony was shared in services, on stages, and through conversations between strangers who said, "You need to hear about this boy who died and came back with a message from Jesus." And as more people listened, something began to stir. It wasn't just curiosity. It wasn't just fascination. It was conviction. The kind of quiet stirring that makes people question the lives they're living. Because Landon wasn't just saying heaven is real, he was saying heaven is close. He wasn't just saying Jesus is alive, he was saying Jesus is coming back. And in a world like ours, that message cuts deep. Look around. People are angry, afraid, exhausted. Culture is spinning out. Families are breaking apart. Violence is normalized. Faith is mocked. People are more connected than ever but feel more alone than they've ever been. We scroll past tragedies like they're memes, argue over everything and trust almost nothing. But then someone like Landon speaks, and it all stops, because a voice like his doesn't belong to the noise. It doesn't come from politics or media or trends. It comes from somewhere else, somewhere eternal. And when he tells people that Jesus gave him a mission, personally, they listen. Not because he's special, not because he wants attention, but because deep down, they know something is coming, something big, and they're not ready. Landon's warning wasn't full of fire and fear, it was full of urgency. He said Jesus told him time is short, that the world needs to wake up, that the church can't afford to stay silent anymore, and that you, are not guaranteed tomorrow. He didn't return with a vague philosophy or a feel-good message. He came back with marching orders: spread the truth, live boldly, love relentlessly, and stop wasting time. Because while the world is busy arguing, Jesus is preparing to return. And when he does, it won't be to send messages through boys like Landon. It will be to separate those who were ready from those who weren't. That's what shook people. That's what continues to shake them. And this message doesn't just sit quietly in the background anymore. It clashes with everything our culture tells us to chase: fame, power, pleasure, comfort. It collides with politics, especially in a time when leaders rise promising hope but deliver division. When people put their trust in presidents, policies, and headlines instead of the one who made them, you don't have to be a prophet to see how lost we've become, but you also don't have to stay that way. Landon's story reminds us that we are not forgotten, that God still speaks, that He's still reaching out through dreams, near-death moments, and even children, to call us home before it's too late. And that brings us to today, to you, watching, wondering what to make of all this. Maybe you believe, maybe you're skeptical, maybe you're somewhere in between, but ask yourself this: what if it's all true? What if Landon really did meet Jesus? What if heaven is real and closer than we think? What if we're not living in just another ordinary moment in history, but on the edge of eternity? Look at what's happening in the world. Look at the confusion, the lawlessness, the spiritual hunger that no entertainment or ideology can satisfy. People are longing for something real, and whether you love Donald Trump or can't stand him, his rise wasn't random. It was part of a shaking, a wake-up call, a reminder that systems are breaking and people are looking for someone, something, to anchor them. But no political figure, no matter how powerful, can offer what Jesus offers. Trump may be on the thumbnail, he may stir opinions, crowds, headlines, but Landon's story isn't about Trump. It's about truth, it's about eternity. It's about what happens when the world ends and the light comes. Landon was sent back to tell us the King is coming. The question is, are you ready? Because when Jesus comes again, there will be no time to debate, no time to prepare, no time to change your mind. The window to choose will have already closed. And if that sounds harsh, remember, He already warned us. Through prophets, through scripture, through miracles. And now, through a boy who died, met Jesus and came back so you could hear this today. So what will you do with it? Dismiss it as coincidence? Or let it be the moment your life turns around forever? You've heard the story, you've felt the weight. Now it's your move.